Good afternoon and welcome to Catalyst Virtual Thought Leadership Webinar. My name is Dave Mason and I am the Director of Sales for our company. For some, this is your first interaction with Catalyst. For others, you know us quite well. For those that don't know our company, we are the Northwest premier commercial furniture provider and have been in business for 38 years. These thought leadership webinars are an opportunity to share the latest in trends and ideas, and we are thrilled that you have taken the time out of your busy schedules to join us today. Please take note of the Q&A section below. We should have enough time at the end for a couple of questions. Also, there's a very short survey at the end of the webinar. If you wouldn't mind taking 60 seconds to answer the short list of questions, we would greatly appreciate it. Someone once said, "There is no team without trust." When it comes to psychological safety, the highest performing teams have one thing in common: the belief that you won't be punished when you make a mistake. Psychological safety allows for moderate risk-taking, the ability to speak your mind, and the freedom to add creatively. All examples of the types of behaviors that potentially lead to market breakthroughs. Because of our incredible partnership with Herman Miller, we at Catalyst are excited to have one of the foremost experts on psychological safety here today to dive into greater detail about this very relevant and important topic. Heather Esposito is a senior learning strategist with Herman Miller. She specializes in working with leaders on their leadership development and coaching skills. She helped to develop a brain-based coaching program that recently won a gold award from Chief Learning Officer magazine and a bronze award from Brandon Hall Consulting. Heather is a professional certified coach with the International Coach Federation. She has been in sales and learning and development for the last 23 years. In the last 5 years, she has focused much of her work around the neuroscience of quality conversations, growth mindset, and psychological safety, while serving as an internal coach and learning strategist for business executives at Herman Miller. Outside of work, she is wife to Eddie and mother to Jordan, Maddie, and Amelia. She is currently pursuing a master's degree in leadership and human resource development through Louisiana State University. In her spare time, she enjoys reading, doing puzzles, anything crafty, and is a master of Candy Crush Saga. Heather, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Great, welcome.
And thank you for that nice welcome. Just want to make sure, is the presentation visible for your screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Excellent. Well, thank you for having me here today. I'm really excited to present this information. It's been a relevant topic for us here in sales for the last 3 to 4 years. It's something that we have been very purposeful about integrating, and in light of us coming through a pandemic and the world situation that we have today, I believe it's even more relevant than ever. So we're going to jump right in. And really, this is just about putting people first. If we want people to be at their best and show up at their best at work, creating psychological safety is one of the best ways to do that. So our agenda for today is just to give you a brief introduction, help you understand a little bit more, about what psychological safety is, but also help you walk away today with some practical application tips of some things that you can do to better understand your own psychological safety and how to create psychological safety for others. So let's start a little bit with what science tells us. So our brains are wired for one purpose. It is wired to keep you safe. And all of the wiring in your brain is dedicated to, not all, but the majority of your wiring is dedicated to scanning your environments for threats and helping you react and make decisions accordingly so that not only you as a species stay alive, but also you as an individual. And we're going to talk about a couple of the parts of the brain that are really involved with scanning for this and managing this, because it'll help explain what we're doing when we try to create psychological safety on a neurobiological level. So the first part of the brain that we're going to talk about is called the amygdala. You may have heard this referred to as your fight or flight brain, your reptilian brain, your ancient brain, and all of those are names for this one small part of the brain that's called the amygdala. It's actually part of the limbic brain, which is our emotional brain. And what this part of our brain is known for is being very instinctive and impulsive. It's reactionary and emotional. It's constantly working at a non-conscious level, meaning it's underneath the surface, almost like it's on autopilot. It is focused on threats and things that could be potentially dangerous for you. And then in return, it drives that fight or flight fear response. So very, very small, but powerful part of your brain that is constantly running under the surface to make sure that you are safe. And that's true not only physically, but psychologically as well. Now, luckily, we are not ruled by only that portion of our brain. We also have something called the prefrontal cortex. It's located here in the front part of your brain. You may hear me refer to it today as the PFC, is for short. And this is your rational and logical brain. It is designed for you to do your conscious thinking. When you say, I want to think about that, or I want to think about strategy, or you're regulating your behavior, you're doing that from the prefrontal cortex. So in contrast to the amygdala, this part of your brain is very considerate. It's very controlled. We would describe it as more rational, more logical. It works on a conscious level, and it focuses on things like thinking and learning. And so this is where we show up when we're being innovative, when we're being creative, when our productivity increases. And again, as I mentioned, even regulating our social behavior happens from this part of our brain. And most importantly, it has the ability to put the brakes on some of those amygdala's automated reactions that we're going to learn a little bit more about in a minute. So what I want to do is kind of put some context around how your brain gets threatened. And I think one of the easiest ways to do that is to think about classifying threats at 3 different levels. When we encounter things that create stress, or the neuroscience word is threat or trigger to the brain, it activates that amygdala at some level. So a level 1 threat is just like this savanna out here. You can look out there, you see a beautiful landscape, but we know that there are dangerous animals that live on a savanna, even though we can't see them. So if you were sitting here and you were trying to do something conscious, like read a book or pay attention or focus on something, you'd be able to do that, but you might find yourself glancing up occasionally just to check your surroundings. So there's a heightened level of threat, but it's not preventing you from staying focused for periods of time. We would describe those as a level 1 threat. Another way to think about those are, there are threats going on in the world, but maybe I don't feel it in my country, or I don't feel it in my state, so I'm less concerned about it, but I know it's out there. The next level is a level 2 threat. At this point, we have spotted an animal. They may not have spotted us, but now we know that the level of threat has increased. And at this point, you would find yourself less able to stay focused, less able to pay attention. I'm sure you can all relate as we've come through the pandemic, especially in the beginning when there was so much that was unknown. Those felt like much higher threats that affected our focus. If we were trying to pay attention to the work that we needed to do, or do heads down concentrating, it was very, very difficult. We had a lot of distractions with having children at home, trying to manage homeschooling, having spouses or partners at home that we're not used to working with full time. We were worried about the health of our families, the health of ourselves. There were just so many things that were vying for attention that your PFC was less able to pay focused attention, because that amygdala is saying, wait, we need to take care of you first. Now, when the threat gets to be really high, we call that a level 3 threat. This means that it's now like in my neighborhood, on my street, the lion has you in his sights and he's headed for you. If I asked you, what do you really want to do right now, David? Like, let's think through your options. You would look at me like I'm crazy, because that part of your brain would not even be able to function. Thinking through strategic options, thinking through rationally or logically what I want to do is virtually impossible. At this point, we are completely ruled by our emotions. We are completely driven by our instinctive, impulsive responses. And in some cases, you might even find it difficult to fight. Like even if you had a weapon at your side, it would be hard to make that decision to pull it up, or it might be hard to flee and run because you're paralyzed with fear. So the anxiety gets so high that you're now in panic mode, and sometimes you might even just freeze is another response that can happen. So I just want you to think about yourself and think about the world over the last few months. We kind of had the height of what we felt was the extreme danger of the pandemic, and that has subsided some. And then we've had racial injustices and things that have plagued our world that we weren't expecting, that have raised the trigger level again. Maybe your family has been more impacted by others economically or with the virus. Maybe you've had family who have been, that's been extra concerns. So kind of think about yourself over the last few months, and can you identify where you were at these different levels of threat, and how did that impact your ability to focus, your ability to pay attention, your ability to stay on top of things, your ability to concentrate in any one area. You may have found yourself becoming more emotional, more reactive. You might have been more impulsive than you normally are. And then kind of think about where you are right now in this moment. Are you still at a level 3 threat? Are you at a level 2 threat? Or have you dialed that back maybe to a level 1? So just kind of think about how some of that's impacted you. And while you're doing that, I'm going to move on and show you a little bit about what's happening in these two parts of your brain when you're under those levels of threat. So let's talk about first when you're under a level 2, a level 3 threat. And we would call that highly triggered or under extreme stress. And when this happens, the amygdala is basically in control, which is why you're seeing that highlighted here. When that happens, we become more impulsive. We become more biased. We tend to be more negative. We do have a negativity bias. The amygdala does not like things that are ambiguous. So if it doesn't know that it's good for you, it will automatically assume that it's not. It is better to assume not and keep you safe than to make an error in judgment and pretend that something's going to be good. So we become more negative, and we tend to have more emotional outbursts. That's because this amygdala is pulling resources from the prefrontal cortex. One of the ways to think about this is like a seesaw or potentially a tug of war. As one side gets more of the resource, the other side loses resource. And so there's only so much energy and glucose to feed the body. And when that happens, we pull resources from the prefrontal cortex. There's also a lot of neurobiology with hormones and neurotransmitters that are going on here. So we're flooding the body with hormones and neurochemicals that also stimulate certain parts of the body to become active and to reduce resources to things like our conscious thinking. In this instance, you're going to have more adrenaline, you're going to have more cortisol, which helps to raise your blood pressure, helps to raise your respirations, all the things you would need to fight or flee. So when this happens and we take resources away from the prefrontal cortex, we'll find ourselves becoming less focused, less productive, less creative, and having less self-control. So this is why it's not good for us as a species to stay in these level 2 or level 3 threats. Now, when we can keep those threats manageable, so we can keep them at a level 1 or a low level 2, then we're better able to let the prefrontal cortex do its job and keep the brakes on some of those amygdala's lower brain reactions. When we're able to do that, we become more focused, more productive, more creative, and we have more self-control, because that part of our brain is saying, you know what, I understand you're trying to keep me safe, but you don't need to keep me safe. Here's why. And so we can logically override some of those automatic responses, which help us become less impulsive, less biased, less negative, and less emotional. The key takeaway here is that when we are being brain friendly, that's the word that we like to use, meaning we're working with the way our brain is neurobiologically wired to take care of us, we can keep the threat level manageable and keep the PFC in control. So we're going to move into a little bit of psychological safety, because when we are psychologically safe, that is one of the ways that we can keep the PFC in better control. You may be familiar with Google's Project Aristotle research. This was a research project that they undertook because they wanted to understand why their high-performing teams were high-performing. They started out with a hypothesis that it was probably common experience, common education, common interest, and so this team bonded really well. And in their first round, they could not identify anything that was common to characteristics, traits, intelligence, backgrounds, any of those things. And as they dug further into what they had been hearing from their high-performing teams, they determined that psychological safety, meaning that the team members felt safe to take risks and be vulnerable in front of each other, was the number one factor in whether a team would be high performing. And it was also the number one predictor of whether a team would be high performing, is having a high level of psychological safety, which makes complete sense with all the things we just learned about the brain. Being vulnerable and taking risks are critical. You cannot have creativity and innovation without vulnerability and risk taking. So that definitely supported that research. And the way they found the term psychological safety is by digging into the academic research. And this is Amy Edmondson. She's a researcher from Harvard. She coined the term psychological safety in her 1999 doctoral dissertation. And she defined psychological safety as the belief that one will not be judged or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. And this really is a team level concept, that the team is safe for interpersonal risk taking. It is hard to have a psychologically safe organization if you don't have teams that are psychologically safe. So by creating at the micro level a team that is psychologically safe, you can create a culture of psychological safety. And one of the models that we use at Herman Miller for understanding how to create psychological safety is the safety model from the Academy of Brain-Based Leadership. They have identified through the neuroscience research 5 social needs of the brain. So just like our brain needs food and water and rest to be able to function well at a physical level, it also has social needs that it needs to have met. If you're familiar with some of Herman Miller's research around the fundamental human needs in a living office, based on the same body of research. And what we know is that when these needs are being met in a meaningful way, it creates reward in the brain. When they're not being met the way we need them to be met, or worse, they're even being violated, what this will do is create trigger or threat in the brain. And we already learned, when we learned a little bit more about our amygdala, that's exactly the part of your brain you're activating when we become triggered or we feel that we're being threatened or one of these social needs is not being met. I will let you know that we all need all of them. It's not something like, oh, well, if I get one, I don't have to worry about the others. No, we all have a certain amount of each of these that we need. What's unique for each of us is how sensitive we are to them. Some of us are more sensitive to 1 or 2 and less sensitive to others. And so we call that kind of like your fuse, if you will, and they'll become a little more clear as we go in. The other thing with this is if you're familiar with some of the behavioral styles research like DISC or MBT, Myers-Briggs, the safety needs are not fixed over your lifetime. Some of them you will see like, oh, that's pretty important to me and it's wired to my behavioral style, but it is shown through the research that these needs do change with our context. So I can share a personal example. Typically, I have a pretty low need for what's called security, and we'll talk about that next. And in most instances, I really enjoy change. I like the excitement that comes from change and the fact that I get to do something different. But during the pandemic, I found myself craving more security than normal because there was enough other things going on in my world that I didn't need to create more uncertainty through my work environment. So I found myself craving more security during that environment. And so it does change with context. So we're going to go through each one, give you a little insight into what it is, how you can proactively address it, and even ask for what you need and potentially create it more for others. So this need for security is about our need for predictability. Our brain is largely a prediction machine. One of the ways that it works so effectively and processes all of the inputs that it takes in is because it works on patterns and predictions. So if things have happened a certain way, or we know that a certain smell, a certain look, a certain word means something, our brain can automatically process that for us. So it likes things to be predictable. It likes things to be consistent. We like when we have commitment. It's more comfortable when we have certainty. And sometimes when we can't have certainty, like we've had lately, at least having clarity is rewarding to the brain. If you have a high need for security, you're probably someone who likes, you like instructions, you may like information, a lot of information provided to you, because when you have that information, it helps you be more consistent and more certain. You might be someone that likes things to be more routine. You like to come to work and you like to expect certain things, so you might work very well in that type of environment. Where somebody like myself, who's a lower need for security, I like change. I like the excitement that comes from change. That doesn't bother me at all. So just to show you, some people have a very high need, some people have a very low need. Ways that we can proactively address security, for not only for ourselves, but for others, is to communicate often and well. One of the worst things that happens in our brain when we don't have complete information is we create stories. We create stories that make sense of the few facts that we know. So the less that we're communicating, and the more opportunity our brain has to create stories. And you can imagine what kind of stories it creates. Remember, we have a negative bias, so we are going to create stories that kind of paint worst case scenario, or things that would cause us to believe falsely in some things, so that we can keep ourselves safe and protect us from potential harm. So along with communication, just setting expectations about what the cadence of communication would be. This is true with family, friends, work associates. If we don't want people to be waiting for information. Again, we start creating stories like, oh, I wonder why they didn't get back with me. I bet it was X. So if we know that you're going to get back in a week, make sure you get back in a week. If you want it to be 2 weeks, just state that so that nobody's wondering why you haven't been communicating. And most importantly, this is true all the time, but especially in times like we're going through right now, make sure to make the implicit things explicit. Assume nothing. If you don't know the acronym of assume, look it up, but it does not serve us well when we make assumptions. So if you think that something should be communicated, or you're wondering whether someone knows a fact, go ahead and be explicit and share it. That helps to meet people's needs for security. Another way that we can do that is just by asking, what other information would be helpful for you right now? That way somebody can specifically say, it would be really helpful if I knew X, or it would be really helpful if I could understand more about Y. And that helps us get our own needs for security met. I can share with you one specific example of this that happened recently, or that happens pretty frequently in sales. As you start to develop more of this vocabulary, you can then start asking for what you need with this language. So it would not be uncommon to have someone in sales say, you know what, my need for security is really feeling threatened right now. It would be helpful if I could get more information, or if you could tell me what's going to be happening with this situation. And that way it goes away from the language of blame, or, you know, you didn't tell me something, or you're hiding something from me, which is what we do when we get triggered. We get defensive, we get judgmental. If I say my need for security is not being met, what I need is X, we're no longer pointing fingers, we're no longer blaming, we're just putting the need on the table, and now we can talk about it as a thing, like I need security to help me do my best work, and we take the emotion out of it. So therefore, we're able to keep ourselves in our PFC with a very logical, rational conversation around this thing, security. And that's going to be true of all the needs. All right, the next one is autonomy. This is our need and desire to have perceived choice or control over our environment. we all like to feel like we have some ownership in what's happening to us. In fact, when we don't have that, it's not only triggering to our psychological health, but to our physical health as well. And there's a lot of research that supports that. Somebody who's high in autonomy probably likes to have a lot of choice and control in their work. For example, I'm also high in autonomy. I prefer that you tell me what you're trying to achieve. Like, what do you want the outcome of this project to be? And then turn it over to me and let me go figure out how to get it done. If you wanted to tell me every single step of the way, it feels like you don't trust me or that you don't think I'm capable of doing it. So each person needs different levels. People with a low need for autonomy actually like to get more information. They work very well in a structured environment process. So not everyone has a high need for autonomy. But ways that you can proactively address this is find ways to give people choices they weren't expecting. You can use this with your family too. I used to have a very strong, well, I still have a very strong-willed son, but when he was younger, it was often hard to tell him what to do. He would just rebel because you had told him what to do. So we got smarter, and one of the things that we did was we offered autonomy. So would you like to do your homework first, or would you like to take your bath first? They were both things that we needed to get done, but when he had perceived choice or control about which one he wanted to do first, he was much more compliant. And that's true of all of us. I mean, find ways to provide that unexpected autonomy. As a self-management tool, especially when things are uncertain and we have a lot of people that may be making decisions on our behalf, when we can return to work, what events we can participate in, how much freedom we have in our communities. How can you focus on the things that you can do and the things that are within your control, that are within those boundaries? That helps you start focusing not on what you can't do, but what you can do within the boundaries or expectations. And you can also help other people see the choices they have. What is a new way of looking at this? Even though you can't go see your customer, what are some creative ways that you could engage with them right now? And it starts to create and keep us in the PFC, which is where we do our creative, innovative thinking. And it also helps us realize that even though we may not have complete autonomy, we do have more choice and control than what we sometimes give ourselves credit for. And a great question for others is just to ask them, what are the things that are within your control? Ask yourself that. It's a very helpful question when you're feeling like your need for autonomy is either not being met or it's being triggered. The third need is fairness. And fairness is our need for the exchanges to be fair both to us and with others. We've seen this very much so in the current environment with some of the racial injustices that we're facing, and people who felt like they have not been treated fairly. And honestly, they haven't. They have not had fair exchanges within our society. So how do we address that? Be as transparent as possible. Just, share what you do know, because people think that you're hiding things if you're not giving as much information as possible. And then more importantly, give people the opportunity to contribute and have their voice heard. You can do that by asking a simple question like, what is your perspective on blank? The fourth need is esteem, and this is our need to be regarded highly by others. It's shaped not only by our self-esteem, but how others see us, or how we think others see us, and how we compare ourselves to one another. So one of the important things here is, don't take things too personally. We tend to use things that we don't understand as a reflection on us personally and give a personal message about that, like, oh, I'm sure I didn't do a good job, or they're not returning my call because of whatever. We'll tend to tell a more personal story. So just especially in times like this, don't do that. Make sure to show appreciation and acknowledge others' efforts and progress. That helps them to feel good about the work they are doing and the contributions they are making. And when we get those needs rewarded, we tend to continue to repeat that to get more of that. And then maximize your social connections. Find ways to stay connected with others. If you have a high need for esteem and it is important to you that you're highly regarded, we all need that at some level, but some of us need it more than others. And it's important to stay connected socially to get that. And a great question to proactively address this is, what's something you've accomplished that you feel really good about, and let somebody celebrate something that they've done or some progress that they've made. Last is this area of trust, and it's a little bit different than what we normally think about. This is our need to be connected to others and a valued member of the team. In the neuroscience world, we talk about our need to be in group with others. And with physical distancing, for people who have a high need for trust and a high need for that team dynamic, this has been a really challenging need to get met. One of the ways that we can do this, especially when we're going through some of the social issues that we're facing right now, is the way we bring people into our in-group is focusing on things we have in common, shared experiences that we have. We may not have the same background, we may not have the same color skin, but we all experiences, we visited common places, we have common friends, we have common likes, and the more things we have in common with each other, the more our brain will override our biases and see them as like us and likable. And so that's an important piece of ways to help build people into our in-group. Use language that says we, not I. I is a solo language, we is a community language. And then find creative ways to connect. Use video, Zoom happy hours, find ways to connect that you may not have used before that allows you to still feel those social connections. You could ask, what would help you or what would help your employees feel more connected right now? And the last one, you may have heard me talk about 5, but the why is really not a domain that we measure, but it's what makes you uniquely you. It is those behavioral styles. It is the experiences that you've had. It is your current context. It drives why those other 5 needs are high or low or more important or less important to you. And I just want to leave you with this, that our words do matter. The way we deliver our words can create threat or can create reward. The words that we choose can create threat or create reward. So one of the ways that we can create psychological safety is being more conscious about how our language impacts others, and also be more cognizant of how triggers can be landing on us, and that we can control how we react to those if we stop and slow down and realize, oh, this is just a threat to my security. This is just a threat to my autonomy. And then we can proactively address that with some of the strategies I shared with you today. So David, I'm going to turn it over to you. I know we're running close on time, so if I'm happy to stay on and answer any questions if our audience is willing to hang on.
Thanks, Heather. So there is one question. And it is, would you be willing to share the diagram showing the amygdala states and PFC states?
Yes, sure.
Awesome, great. So we'll make sure that that the attendees have access to that. I know we are a bit over time, so I just want to be sensitive to that. But one last question.
Yes.
Where can one go for more information on this topic?
Yeah, I actually pulled out the book so I'd have it. The Academy for Brain-Based Leadership has published this book called Psychological Safety. It's by Dan Radecki and Leonie Hull. It is available on Amazon, but I highly recommend it. And there's a testimonial from Herman Miller is part of the foreword, because we have been a partner with them. And the Academy for Brain-Based Leadership also has a website, academy-bbl.com. They are the founders of the safety model. You can Google psychological safety, Amy Edmondson, and find lots of great resources as well.
Great. Heather, thank you so much for doing this today. Learned a lot, and we really appreciate you being here. So
yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. I hope this was helpful to your audience, and it's something they can immediately put into practice. This slide just leaves them with some ideas of what they can do, what's next, to be able to put this into practice for themselves, their families, and their at work.
So we really appreciate it, Heather. Thank you again, and hope everyone has a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.